What if the reason nothing is moving is not heaven? And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. Because what you've been calling a divine blockage might be the most revealing moment God has ever placed in your life. You wake up tired, you try again, you push forward, but inside, something feels off. You've been praying, you've been believing, you've been giving, trusting, waiting. And yet, the doors that should be open aren't. The breakthrough that should have come hasn't. And somewhere in the silence, a quiet question starts to rise. Is God blocking me? Here's what most people do with that question. They pray harder. They fast longer. They look for spiritual warfare, for hidden sin, for something outside of themselves to explain why things aren't moving. And while none of that is wrong, there's a deeper possibility, one that's uncomfortable but absolutely transformative, that the block isn't coming from heaven. It's coming from you, not because you're bad, not because you lack faith, but because there are places inside of you, patterns of fear, habits of control, misaligned priorities that are quietly working against the very thing you're asking God for. Most people misunderstand what this season is actually about. They're waiting for God to open a door while they're standing on the other side, holding the handle from the inside. The door isn't locked from His side, it's held shut from yours. That hidden layer, the one underneath the effort and the faith, is where God is doing His deepest work. And it's also where most people stop looking. There's a pattern God has used again and again in Scripture that explains this better than most sermons ever could. Around 520 years before Christ, the Jewish people had returned home from exile in Babylon. They were free, they had land, they had resources, and the temple of God, the center of their spiritual life, sat in ruins. But here's what was happening. The people were building their own houses, beautiful, paneled houses. They were investing in personal comfort, personal security, personal advancement. And God sent the prophet Haggai to say something they weren't expecting. He said in chapter 1, verse 6, "You plant much, but harvest little. You eat, but are never satisfied. You drink, but are still thirsty. Your wages disappear as though you were putting them in pockets filled with holes." That's not a description of divine punishment. That's a description of misalignment. The people weren't idle, they were working hard. But comfort had become a silent spiritual barrier. They were managing their own lives so carefully that there was no room left for obedience. And the result was exhaustion that felt, from the outside, like God was holding back blessing. He wasn't blocking them. He was exposing the gap between what they were building and what actually mattered. God does not accelerate misalignment. He reveals it. Before you conclude that God is silent, ask yourself the question Haggai asked. What are you building, and for whom? In a culture that celebrates ambition, we invest deeply in careers, platforms, image, security, and then wonder why the spiritual foundation feels unstable. Haggai's message wasn't stop working. It was reorder your investment. Stay with me, because the next layer is where most people miss it entirely. In Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 5 through 8, the prophet draws one of the sharpest contrasts in all of wisdom literature. Judah was surrounded by threat, and rather than trusting God, the leaders were forming political alliances with Egypt, anchoring their security in human strategy. Jeremiah says, "Cursed is the man who trusts in human strength. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord." Here's the modern version of that. You don't want God to provide. You want to control the mechanism of provision. You want the promotion you can track, the connection you can leverage, the strategy that makes sense on paper. And when those systems don't deliver, it feels like God is withholding. But what if He's simply watching what you trust more, Him or the system? This is where self-sabotage enters the room in the quietest way possible, not through visible failure, but through the illusion of readiness without real alignment. Proverbs 16 verse 2 says, "All a person's ways seem pure to them, but the Lord weighs the spirit." You can believe your motives are clean. You can believe you're waiting on God when, honestly, you might be waiting on yourself to feel safe enough to fully let go. Spiritual maturity is not knowing more, it's trusting more with less certainty. And that leads to the deepest layer, one most people never want to look at. In James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, the apostle addresses a community in conflict. People were striving, competing, praying, and receiving nothing. And James says something that cuts deep. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives. Wrong motives don't always look like greed. Sometimes they look like comparison. You want the platform because someone else has one and it makes you feel behind. You want the breakthrough because the silence feels like rejection. You want success not as an act of stewardship, but as an answer to shame. That kind of asking doesn't unlock, it exposes. It exposes that beneath the prayer for purpose is a hunger for approval. And God cares too much about your character to hand acceleration to someone whose foundation isn't ready for the weight. Here's the question that cuts through everything. What if the obstacle is the version of you that hasn't died yet? That's not condemnation. That's the most compassionate thing God could show you. Because here's what He is truly doing in this season. He is not blocking your growth. He is breaking the version of you that would misuse it. He's removing the false security, the certainty that comes from controlling outcomes instead of trusting Him. That removal feels like loss, but it's clearing the ground for something real. He's reshaping the hidden pride that asks for forward movement while resisting the surrender that makes it possible. That reshaping feels like humiliation, but it's preparation. And He is rebuilding your foundation, your faith, your character, your obedience, so that when the doors open, you're not just stepping through them. You're ready to carry what's on the other side. God prioritizes alignment before acceleration, always. So here's how to apply this today. Stop asking God to remove the pressure and start asking what the pressure is revealing. Write down one area where you're trusting in human strategy more than divine direction. Ask yourself honestly, do I want this for purpose or for validation? Begin to realign, not perfectly but honestly. Give God access to the part of your life you've been managing on your own. Don't run from the exposure. Exposure is not rejection, it's invitation. You are not stuck because God forgot you. You're in a season of alignment, not abandonment. The delay is not punishment, it's positioning. What you're experiencing is not the absence of God's power. It's the presence of His patience forming something in you that cannot be rushed. You're not failing, you're being formed. If this spoke to your spirit, type alignment in the comments as a declaration that you're ready for growth, not just breakthrough. In the next video, we'll talk about the one internal pattern that blocks more Christians than anything else, and almost nobody sees it in themselves. Keep trusting. Keep moving. God is working, even when you can't see it. God bless you.